In 1615, 4 accomplices were executed for participating in a brutal poisoning inside the Tower of London. The mastermind behind this assassination was Robert Carr, the Earl of Somerset and the ultimate favorite of King James I. While the lower-class executors choked to death on the gallows, Carr used his royal influence to bypass the executioner's axe. Carr murdered his strategist, Thomas Overbury, using arsenic-laced pastries and a fatal dose of acid simply because the man opposed his illicit affair. Despite a court-approved execution, King James I directly suspended the death warrant, allowing a convicted murderer to slip through the net and leaving behind a justice system permanently stained by royal corruption. The story of Robert Carr begins with a major shift in English politics. In 1603, Queen Elizabeth I died without an heir. This event marked the end of the long-ruling Tudor dynasty. King James VI of Scotland then traveled south to take the throne, uniting the crowns as King James I of England. When James arrived in London, his ruling style quickly shocked the political elite. For 40 years, the government was used to Elizabeth's distant and formal authority. She had maintained control by keeping her ambitious noblemen at a strict distance. James, however, dismantled this stoic approach to royal leadership. Instead of using traditional formal channels, James sought close personal connections. His court operated in an informal and homosocial environment. The king managed his state affairs primarily through a culture of male favorites. These were carefully chosen, attractive young men who received his unwavering political and personal devotion. James was openly affectionate with these favorites in front of his senior ministers. The English establishment soon realized that the traditional rules of power had changed. To pass a law or shape foreign policy, politicians could no longer just petition Parliament. All political access now flowed directly through the king's current favorite. Robert Carr was not born with the traditional background needed to govern a nation. He did not possess a brilliant academic mind, military victories, or vast family wealth. He was simply a product of minor Scottish nobility from the Ferniehurst family. Yet he was positioned to take full advantage of this new system. When King James relocated his court to London, a massive influx of Scottish nobles and ambitious fortune seekers followed the monarch south, seeking lucrative positions in the far wealthier English capital. This migration immediately generated severe xenophobic friction. The established English aristocracy fiercely resented the Scottish newcomers, viewing them as unrefined opportunists draining the royal treasury. Carr arrived in this polarized environment as a minor asset. He served merely as a page boy, a low-ranking logistical servant attached to the retinue of George Home, the Earl of Dunbar. Carr was tasked with running mundane errands across the sprawling palace complexes. Recognizing his lack of sophistication, his sponsors briefly sent him to France to acquire the basic courtly aesthetics, manners, and linguistic skills required to survive in aristocratic circles. He returned to England possessing an athletic physique and striking blonde features, but he remained a complete political unknown, holding no influence within the cutthroat factions of Whitehall. The event that violently altered the course of British constitutional history occurred on March 24, 1607, during an elaborate public tilting match in London. Jousting in the early 17th century was not merely an athletic exhibition. It was a formalized, dangerous political theater. Accession Day tilts and royal tournaments were the primary arenas where young aristocrats displayed their physical prowess, their wealth through ornamented armor, and their loyalty in a desperate bid to catch the sovereign's eye and secure royal patronage. During this specific tournament, the young Robert Carr was operating on the periphery of the main event. He was tasked with serving as an equerry, specifically ordered to ride down the tilt yard to deliver a ceremonial shield and a message from his master, Lord Dingwall, directly to King James I, who was observing from the elevated royal gallery. As Carr spurred his horse forward, the animal suddenly slipped on the uneven ground. The horse violently threw the young rider to the dirt. The crushing impact snapped Carr's leg. His immediate cries of excruciating physical trauma echoed across the silenced tiltyard. King James I, watching from the stands, was instantly and profoundly captivated. The monarch was struck by a specific combination of factors: Carr's vibrant youth, his undeniable physical aesthetics, and his unshielded vulnerability in a moment of intense trauma. The King of England bypassed standard medical protocols and personally intervened in the fate of a lowly page boy. James ordered Carr to be carefully lifted from the dirt, carried directly into the secure perimeter of Whitehall Palace, and placed in a private suite. The king assigned his finest, most exclusive royal physicians to manage the young man's recovery. However, James I did not merely fund the medical care, he monopolized the patient. The sovereign visited the recovering page boy every single day. James, an educated, deeply intellectual man who prided himself on his theological and linguistic scholarship, essentially adopted Carr. The king sat by the bedside for hours, personally teaching the young Scot Latin grammar to pass the time during the grueling months of bone recovery. This specific interaction established the foundational dynamic of their relationship. James demanded total control, needing to play the paternal educator to a submissive dependent. Carr, isolated and reliant on the king's goodwill for his physical and financial survival, accepted the role perfectly. From a literal shattered limb, a political unknown was vaulted seamlessly into the epicenter of the highest executive authority. Carr's ascension following his recovery was devoid of traditional political logic. In a functional state, executive power is delegated based on administrative competence, military capability, or massive economic leverage. Carr possessed none of these metrics. But the king's fervent, visible devotion erased his deficits. By 1607, he was appointed a gentleman of the bedchamber, a position that granted him 24-hour, unrestricted physical access to the king. This proximity immediately translated into hard political capital. Anyone seeking an audience with James had to pass through Carr. Recognizing his monopoly on the monarch's time, the seasoned English lords, experienced privy councillors, and elite foreign diplomats from the Bourbon and Habsburg empires were forced to hand the former page boy massive financial bribes merely to secure a 10-minute audience with the sovereign. King James formalized this power through a rapid succession of titles. He knighted Carr, elevating him above the gentry. In 1611, James disrupted the English aristocratic hierarchy by creating Carr the Viscount Rochester. He then shattered precedent entirely by appointing him as the first Scotsman to officially sit on the English Privy Council. The traditional power brokers of England, specifically the ancient, conservative Howard family and the administrative network of the Cecils, watched in horror as a poorly educated, politically illiterate young man assumed control of the state apparatus. Robert Carr held the sovereign authority of the crown in his hands, yet he remained remarkably pragmatic regarding his own cognitive limitations. He knew he lacked the sophisticated legal vocabulary, the administrative stamina, and the strategic geopolitical mind required to govern a rapidly expanding empire. The governance of the English state in the early 17th century was a relentless, grinding bureaucratic machine. It required the daily processing of domestic petitions, the management of a severely depleted royal treasury, and the navigation of an intricate, volatile network of foreign intelligence spanning the Protestant and Catholic powers of Europe. If Carr attempted to dictate state policy autonomously, his ignorance would instantly expose him to the seasoned predators of the Privy Council, who would systematically dismantle his credibility before the king. To survive the vicious, lethal currents of the Stuart court and secure his monopoly on royal power, the favorite required a surrogate intellect. He needed a shadow operator capable of processing the brutal mechanics of the state, while Carr focused on maintaining the physical affection of King James I. He found this exact operational engine in Sir Thomas Overbury. Sir Thomas Overbury was the cognitive antithesis of Robert Carr. Overbury was a brilliant, fiercely sharp intellectual product of the English elite. Educated at Queen's College, Oxford, and trained in English common law at the Middle Temple, he possessed a refined legal and administrative vocabulary. Overbury was an acclaimed poet and a published essayist, but his literary pursuits merely masked a cold, calculating political ambition. Overbury analyzed the rapid ascension of Robert Carr and recognized an unprecedented opportunity. Carr held the ultimate asset, unrivaled, constant proximity to the sovereign, but lacked a navigational system. Overbury offered to function as that system. They forged a flawless operational partnership based on a strict division of labor. Carr managed the physical and emotional maintenance of King James I. He accompanied the king on extended hunting trips, maintained the aesthetic appeal that had secured his position, and acted as the visual proxy of the monarch's authority. Overbury remained in the shadows of Whitehall Palace, managing the administrative reality of the empire. He established a clandestine secretariat. Every single piece of domestic legislation, every royal warrant, and every foreign diplomatic dispatch directed to Carr was first intercepted and processed by Overbury. When Carr was required to deliver a speech before the Privy Council, Overbury wrote the text. When Carr needed to respond to the Spanish or French ambassadors, Overbury provided the precise geopolitical talking points, often utilizing sophisticated cipher codes that Carr himself could not read. This shadow administration functioned with devastating efficiency. To the outside observer, Robert Carr appeared to have rapidly matured into a capable statesman. In reality, Overbury was the undisputed puppet master, steering the sovereign policies of England entirely through Carr's voice. The alliance granted Overbury a level of operational control rarely achieved by an unelected minister. He monopolized state secrets. He vetted the appointment of bishops and judges. Crucially, Overbury managed the extensive lucrative network of bribery that fueled the Jacobean court. He maintained the ledgers, recording exactly which noblemen and foreign agents had paid Carr for royal favors, creating a massive archive of compromising political leverage. However, this reliance bred a fatal psychological pathology within Overbury. He began to view himself not as a servant to the king's favorite, but as the supreme intellectual master of the English state. His ambition mutated into spectacular, unshielded arrogance. Overbury lacked the basic survival instinct of courtly discretion. He openly boasted in the corridors of Whitehall that he alone controlled the king's mind. He developed a profound, vocal disdain for the traditional English nobility, viewing them as archaic, intellectually inferior relics of the Tudor era. He aimed his sharpest, most public insults directly at the oldest and most entrenched political dynasty in the realm, the Howard family. By operating with such aggressive, unchecked pride, Overbury rapidly manufactured a legion of capable, deeply patient enemies. The Howard family, spearheaded by Henry Howard, 1st Earl of Northampton, and Thomas Howard, 1st Earl of Suffolk, constituted the primary conservative power bloc within the English government. They were institutional survivors, having navigated the lethal political purges of the Tudor dynasty to emerge as the dominant force in the Jacobean Privy Council. The Howards controlled the treasury, the admiralty, and the vast networks of regional patronage. The conflict between Overbury and the Howards was not merely a matter of personal insult. It was rooted in a severe, irreconcilable geopolitical divide. Early 17th century Europe was structurally divided by the aftermath of the Reformation. The Howard family represented the pro-Spain, Catholic-leaning faction within the English court. They actively advocated for the Spanish match, a proposed diplomatic alliance and royal marriage between the English crown and the Habsburg Empire. They believed aligning with the wealthiest Catholic superpower would guarantee continental peace and secure their own domestic authority. Sir Thomas Overbury was a staunch, uncompromising Protestant. He vehemently opposed any alliance with Catholic Spain, advocating instead for a militarized Protestant union with the Dutch Republic and the German principalities. Because King James I fundamentally abhorred warfare and sought to maintain diplomatic equilibrium, the foreign policy of England hung entirely in the balance. The deciding vote belonged to the king's favorite, Robert Carr. The Howard faction recognized a stark political reality. As long as Thomas Overbury controlled Carr's intellect, the English state would never align with Spain. Overbury was a mortal threat to the Howard geopolitical agenda. To reclaim control of the government, the Howards needed to sever the symbiotic link between Carr and his shadow operator. The Earl of Northampton, a master of political subversion, analyzed the operational dynamic of his enemies. He recognized that the Howards could never out-argue Overbury in the council chamber, nor could they outmaneuver his control of the state paperwork. To break Overbury's monopoly, they had to bypass the intellect entirely and target Robert Carr's fundamental human vulnerabilities. The Howard network deployed their most devastating, cultivated asset, Frances Howard. Frances was the daughter of the Earl of Suffolk. She possessed legendary physical beauty, but her captivating exterior concealed a refined, ruthlessly ambitious operator conditioned by the cutthroat environment of the Jacobean court. Her entire existence had been utilized as a political instrument by her family. At the age of 15, in 1606, Frances had been forced into a high-profile, transactional political marriage with Robert Devereux, the third Earl of Essex. The marriage was engineered by King James I to reconcile two historically warring factions of the nobility. Immediately following the wedding ceremony, the teenage Earl of Essex was dispatched to the European continent to complete his education and undertake military service, leaving his young bride behind in London. Frances grew up in the heart of the royal court at Whitehall, deeply influenced by its complex and ambitious political environment. When the Earl of Essex returned to England in 1609 to begin their life together, their reunion was hostile. As a sophisticated figure at court, Frances disliked her husband, viewing him as unrefined and politically unimportant compared to her own powerful family. She rejected him, and their marriage quickly deteriorated into a bitter public conflict. Acting under the strategic direction of her uncle, the Earl of Northampton, Frances Howard set her sights directly on Robert Carr. The operation was flawlessly executed. Frances leveraged her proximity at court masques and royal banquets to isolate the king's favorite. Carr, despite his immense political power, remained relatively unsophisticated regarding the psychological manipulations of high-born women. Confronted with the deliberate, focused attention of the most beautiful woman in the English aristocracy, Carr's defensive perimeter collapsed. He fell recklessly, obsessively into the trap. Carr and Frances initiated a passionate, clandestine physical affair. The Howard faction had successfully bypassed the administrative blockade. By securing Carr's romantic and physical devotion, Frances had effectively absorbed the highest authority of the English state directly into the Howard family structure. Sir Thomas Overbury, possessing acute political instincts, detected the shift in Carr's behavior immediately. He analyzed the romance not as a matter of the heart, but as a catastrophic geopolitical hostile takeover. Overbury understood the exact mathematics of the situation. If Robert Carr formalized this relationship and married Frances Howard, Carr would be absorbed into the Howard faction. The conservative pro-Spain syndicate would gain total dominion over the king. Overbury would be immediately stripped of his administrative monopoly, cast out of the government, and likely prosecuted for his past actions once he lost Carr's protective shield. Overbury reacted with aggressive, desperate hostility. He attempted to break the psychological hold Frances had over Carr. He utilized his considerable rhetorical skill to viciously attack her character, publicly branding her a base woman and a filthy strumpet. He presented Carr with detailed intelligence regarding her manipulative history and her family's overarching political agenda. When Carr, Blinded by his attachment to Francis, refused to terminate the affair. Overbury crossed the final fatal line. He delivered a definitive political ultimatum. Overbury declared that if Carr proceeded with any attempt to marry Frances Howard, he would deploy his ultimate contingency plan. Overbury threatened to open the clandestine ledgers. He promised to weaponize every state secret, every record of illicit bribery, and every piece of classified correspondence in his possession to utterly destroy the Howard family and permanently ruin Carr's standing with the king. Overbury believed this threat of mutually assured destruction would force Carr into compliance. He miscalculated. By threatening to deploy state secrets to destroy the king's favorite, Overbury transformed himself from an indispensable administrative asset into an immediate, unacceptable national security threat. The symbiotic alliance was permanently fractured. Robert Carr and the Howards recognized that to secure their future, Thomas Overbury had to be silenced. The fracture between Robert Carr and Sir Thomas Overbury transformed the internal dynamics of the Jacobean court. Overbury's threat to deploy classified state intelligence to destroy the Howard faction escalated a domestic dispute into a severe crisis of state security. However, before the Howard faction could permanently neutralize Overbury, they faced a massive, immediate logistical barrier. To successfully absorb Robert Carr into their political structure, Frances Howard had to legally marry him. Frances was already legally bound to Robert Devereux, the 3rd Earl of Essex. In 17th century England, the dissolution of a high-ranking aristocratic marriage was not a mere administrative procedure. It required navigating a rigid, deeply conservative ecclesiastical legal system that strictly forbade standard divorce. The English legal architecture, governed by the doctrines of the Church of England, dictated that a validly contracted and consummated marriage was an indissoluble sacrament. The only legal mechanism available to sever the union was an official annulment, a decree from an ecclesiastical court stating that the marriage had never been valid in the first place. The most common ground for annulment was non-consummation due to physical impotency. Frances Howard and her legal counsel, funded by the Earl of Northampton, filed a formal petition for nullity on these exact grounds in 1613. This legal strategy, however, presented a severe geopolitical risk. The Earl of Essex was not a minor courtier. He was a prominent, militarily active nobleman with his own powerful faction of allies. Accusing him of total physical impotence in a public legal forum would destroy his aristocratic honor, his capability to secure future political alliances, and his capacity to produce an heir. A total accusation would guarantee a vicious, funded legal counterattack that could drag on for years. To counter Essex's objections, the lawyers presented an unusual legal argument. Frances testified under oath that her husband was healthy and physically capable of sharing a relationship with others. However, she stated he was completely unable to fulfill his marital duties exclusively with her. She blamed this specific limitation on dark magic, arguing that targeted witchcraft had been used to curse their union. This specific legal phrasing provided the Earl of Essex with a crucial exit strategy. By accepting the claim of targeted witchcraft, Essex could agree to the annulment without sacrificing his public masculinity or his future prospects. He confirmed in court that despite his best efforts, he had been physically unable to consummate the union. To legally validate the claim of non-consummation, the ecclesiastical court required biological proof. Frances Howard was subjected to a formal medical examination to verify her virginity. This procedure was conducted by a specialized jury consisting of aristocratic matrons and professional midwives. The examination was an act of profound public degradation, completely stripping the Countess of her privacy. However, the integrity of this medical audit was immediately compromised by the extreme political pressure applied by the Howard faction. During the physical examination, Frances insisted on wearing a thick, heavy veil, claiming she was overwhelmed by modesty and extreme humiliation. The midwives certified her intact virginity, and the medical documentation was submitted to the court. Almost instantly, the clandestine information networks of London erupted with detailed, damaging rumors. The public and the anti-Howard factions circulated reports that the woman examined by the midwives was not Frances Howard at all. The prevailing intelligence suggested that the Howards had smuggled a young, physically similar virgin into the examination chamber, utilizing the heavy veil to conceal the surrogate's identity, effectively defrauding the highest ecclesiastical court in the realm. The Commission of Nullity, the panel of elite judges tasked with deciding the case, was presided over by George Abbot, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Abbot was a strict, conservative Calvinist theologian. He possessed a profound disdain for the moral corruption of the Howard family and recognized the annulment proceedings as a blatant, orchestrated legal fabrication. Archbishop Abbot interrogated the evidence rigorously. He challenged the theological validity of the targeted witchcraft claim. He pointed out the overwhelming circumstantial evidence of Frances Howard's active, publicized romantic affairs at court, which directly contradicted the medical certification of her virginity. Abbot successfully rallied a block of judges within the commission to oppose the annulment. The ecclesiastical court deadlocked. The highest religious authority in England effectively refused to rubber stamp the destruction of the Essex marriage. The deadlock presented King James I with a critical crisis. Robert Carr, consumed by his obsession with Francis, demanded the king intervene. The monarch, entirely unable to deny his favorite, deployed the unfettered authority of the royal prerogative to crush the independence of the judicial system. King James bypassed standard legal protocols. He personally drafted extensive theological tracts arguing in favor of the annulment, attempting to publicly humiliate Archbishop Abbot's interpretation of canon law. When the commission still refused to yield, the king executed a brute force administrative override. James actively intimidated the dissenting judges. He then expanded the size of the commission, deliberately packing the court with loyal, subservient bishops, including Thomas Bilson and Lancelot Andrews, who clearly understood that their future political and financial advancements depended entirely on delivering the king's desired verdict. Overwhelmed by direct royal interference, the newly packed commission voted in favor of the annulment in September 1613. Frances Howard was legally severed from the Earl of Essex. The English crown had publicly compromised the integrity of its own legal and religious institutions simply to facilitate the romantic desires of the king's favorite. With the annulment secured, the path was clear for Carr to marry Frances and formally align with the pro-Spain syndicate. However, the underlying threat remained unresolved. Sir Thomas Overbury was still operating within Whitehall, and he still possessed the clandestine ledgers containing the intelligence capable of destroying the Howard faction. The Howards recognized that assassination within the confines of the royal court was logistically impossible and politically suicidal. If Overbury was murdered while holding official positions, the subsequent royal investigation would inevitably lead back to the Howard family. They needed a legally flawless method to physically remove Overbury from the center of power, sever his communication networks, and neutralize his leverage. They found their solution not in violence, but in the strict protocols of foreign diplomacy. Operating through Robert Carr's unimpeded access to the king, the Howard faction engineered a brilliant, legitimate diplomatic trap. In early April 1613, King James I summoned Sir Thomas Overbury and presented him with a massive promotion. The king officially appointed Overbury as the English ambassador to the court of Tsar Michael I of Russia. On the surface, this was a prestigious, lucrative assignment. In reality, it was a meticulously designed political exile. A diplomatic posting to Moscow in the early 17th century meant years of complete isolation. It required a grueling, dangerous maritime journey across the Baltic Sea and deep into the Russian interior. Overbury would be entirely cut off from the daily flow of intelligence in London. He would lose all proximity to the king, and his ability to leverage his classified documents against the Howards would be rendered useless by sheer geographic distance. Overbury analyzed the royal offer and recognized the architecture of the ambush. If he accepted the posting, his political career in England was terminated. To spring the trap, the Howards relied entirely on Overbury's profound arrogance and his misplaced trust in Robert Carr. Carr met with his former shadow operator in secret. Executing the strategy designed by the Earl of Northampton, Carr played the role of the loyal ally. He swore to Overbury that the ambassadorship was a temporary misunderstanding orchestrated by their enemies. Carr delivered a fatal piece of false counsel. He advised Overbury to formally reject the king's appointment. Carr explicitly promised that he would utilize his supreme influence over James to absorb the royal anger and protect Overbury from any legal consequences, ensuring Overbury could remain in London to continue managing the state. Trusting the protective shield of the favorite he had personally engineered, Overbury walked directly into the snare. Under English law, the monarch possessed the unquestionable right to command the service of any subject. Refusing a direct, formalized royal command, especially a high-level diplomatic deployment, was not classified as a mere administrative dispute. It was classified as contempt of the sovereign, a direct challenge to the royal prerogative that bordered on high treason. When Overbury formally and haughtily rejected the Russian ambassadorship, King James I exploded in genuine unscripted rage. The king viewed the refusal as a public, unforgivable insult to his sovereign will. Carr, having orchestrated the exact scenario, stood silently by and offered absolutely no protection. On April 21, 1613, acting on the direct orders of the enraged monarch, royal guards arrested Sir Thomas Overbury. He was stripped of his offices, escorted out of Whitehall Palace, and transported down the River Thames. The heavy wooden gates of the Tower of London closed behind him. The most dangerous, capable intellect in the English government had been successfully and legally neutralized without a single drop of blood being shed. The Howard faction had secured total victory. However, they severely underestimated the ruthless paranoia of Frances Howard. For the Countess, political imprisonment was insufficient. As long as Overbury drew breath and held a pen, he represented a latent threat to her reputation and her future security. The legal trap was merely the first phase of an operation that was about to descend into a calculated, unprecedented campaign of forensic destruction. The heavy wooden doors of the Tower of London sealed Sir Thomas Overbury within the ultimate architectural manifestation of state power. The Howard Network, utilizing the executive authority of Robert Carr, had successfully executed a bloodless political neutralization. For the conservative faction, the primary objective was achieved. The pro-Spain geopolitical agenda was no longer obstructed by Carr's shadow operator. However, for Frances Howard, political imprisonment was an insufficient guarantee of security. She recognized a fundamental operational vulnerability in the English penal system. The Tower of London in the early 17th century was not a sensory deprivation facility. High-ranking political prisoners were traditionally granted comfortable confinement. They were permitted to retain their personal servants, receive external correspondence, and entertain visitors. Frances calculated that as long as Overbury possessed access to ink, paper, and a network of couriers, the classified intelligence regarding the Howard family's corruption could still be weaponized and leaked to the anti-Howard factions in Parliament. To ensure complete operational security for her impending marriage to Robert Carr, Overbury's communication apparatus had to be permanently dismantled and his physical threat permanently neutralized. Executing an assassination within a heavily guarded royal fortress required a sophisticated, multi-tiered conspiracy. It required the systematic corruption of the Tower's administration, the assembly of a clandestine logistics network, and a prolonged forensic siege The immediate logistical obstacle to the assassination was the existing administrative command structure of the Tower. The facility was governed by the Lieutenant of the Tower, Sir William Waad. Waad was a veteran intelligence officer, a rigid disciplinarian, and an operator known for his strict adherence to penal protocol. He meticulously logged every visitor and personally inspected the provisions brought into the secure perimeter. Francis Howard understood that Waad could not be bribed or intimidated into facilitating a murder. Therefore, the command structure had to be purged. She leveraged Robert Carr's monopoly on the king's ear to execute the administrative override. Carr approached King James I and deliberately fabricated severe accusations of financial embezzlement and administrative incompetence against Waad. The king, entirely trusting his favorite's intelligence, authorized the immediate dismissal of the veteran lieutenant to replace Waad. The Howard faction required a specific psychological profile, an individual who possessed sufficient aristocratic standing to hold the office, but who was inherently weak, deeply in debt, and easily manipulated. They identified Sir Gervase Helwys. Helwys was not a hardened military commander. He was an ambitious courtier desperate for financial advancement. To secure the lucrative position of lieutenant, Helwys was required to pay a staggering illicit bribe of £2,000 directly to the Howard family network. By accepting this financial arrangement, Helwys immediately compromised his administrative independence. He was installed as the new lieutenant of the Tower, not to enforce the king's law, but to act as a compliant, passive supervisor for the operations of the Howard network. The top-tier security protocol of the fortress was successfully neutralized, with the oversight apparatus dismantled. Francis Howard required a ground-level operative capable of bypassing the secondary security measures to deliver the lethal payloads directly to the target. Standard protocol dictated that Overbury would be served meals prepared by the Tower kitchens or brought in by his own retainers. To totally control the daily sustenance and isolation of the prisoner, Francis utilized Carr's executive authority to impose a condition of close confinement upon Overbury. This severe classification legally barred Overbury from maintaining personal servants or receiving unvetted visitors. Francis then inserted her own operative into the void. She selected Richard Weston, an elderly, debt-ridden former tailor who had previously acted as a minor courier for the Howard family. Through the deliberate, coercive influence of the new lieutenant, Gervase Helwys, Weston was officially appointed as Overbury's exclusive, personal jailer. Weston was granted sole responsibility for processing Overbury's daily rations, cleaning his quarters, and managing his limited physical environment. To supply Weston with the necessary chemical compounds, Francis activated a deeply entrenched, illicit supply chain operating within the London underworld. The primary logistical node was Anne Turner. Turner was a widow of a prominent physician who operated a successful cosmetics and fashion enterprise, famous for inventing the yellow starch used to stiffen aristocratic collars. Beneath her legitimate mercantile front, Turner functioned as a sophisticated broker for the occult, illegal narcotics, and political espionage. Turner connected Francis Howard with James Franklin, a skilled, profoundly unethical apothecary. Franklin possessed the pharmacological expertise required to synthesize, distill, and weaponize heavy metals and toxic organic compounds. This network, the aristocratic financier, the logistical broker, the chemical manufacturer, and the ground-level operative, formed a decentralized, compartmentalized assassination machine. The objective of the operation was not a sudden, massive cardiac arrest or an immediate respiratory failure. A rapid, unexplained death of a high-profile state prisoner would automatically trigger a forensic inquest by the royal coroner, potentially exposing the conspiracy. The assassination had to masquerade as a natural biological decline. Overbury's death needed to mirror the exact physiological symptoms of severe, naturally occurring diseases prevalent in the 17th century. such as dysentery, severe food poisoning, or the late stages of syphilis. This required a strategy of microdosing, the systematic, prolonged administration of various toxic compounds designed to slowly degrade the victim's internal organ systems over a period of several months. Historical records from the subsequent trials reveal the terrifying breadth of James Franklin's pharmacological arsenal. The syndicate utilized arsenic, which systematically destroyed the gastrointestinal lining and induced massive, uncontrollable hemorrhaging. They deployed sublimate of mercury, a corrosive heavy metal that attacked the central nervous system and caused severe renal failure. Franklin synthesized copper vitriol, copper sulfate, to induce violent, continuous vomiting, leading to fatal dehydration. Most horrifyingly, the network utilized cantharides, a potent toxin extracted from the blister beetle. When ingested, cantharides acts as a severe vesicant, literally blistering the internal mucous membranes from the throat down through the digestive tract, and causing agonizing necrotic destruction of the urinary system. The operational phase commenced in early May 1613. Francis Howard personally oversaw the integration of the chemical compounds into curated food items. The poisons were meticulously baked into elaborate fruit jellies, sugared tarts, and roasted partridges. These items were disguised as innocent care packages from the outside world and delivered to the Tower. Richard Weston received the contaminated provisions at the gates, bypassed the compromised security checks of Lieutenant Helwys, and served them directly to Sir Thomas Overbury. Overbury was subjected to unimaginable physiological trauma. His internal organs began a slow, catastrophic, and agonizing collapse. His body erupted in severe weeping skin ulcers. He suffered from continuous aggressive dysentery, vomiting blood and expelling necrotic intestinal tissue. His hair began to fall out in clumps, and his skin took on a dark, jaundiced pigmentation due to the rapid failure of his liver and kidneys. He was reduced to a state of such agonizing frailty that he was entirely incapable of standing or walking within his cell. As his biological integrity degraded, Overbury realized he was under a systematic chemical attack. Operating in a state of complete desperation, he managed to smuggle out blood-stained letters to the man he believed was his only remaining ally, Robert Carr. Overbury begged Carr for physical extraction. He pleaded for the deployment of royal physicians and the authorization of his release, reminding Carr of the vast political architecture they had built together. Carr's response to these communications remains the most debated aspect of his complicity. He did not dispatch royal doctors, nor did he issue an executive order for Overbury's release. Instead, Carr sent a series of generic, evasive letters promising eventual salvation. Accompanying these letters, Carr sent small vials of white medicinal powders, instructing Overbury to ingest them to cure his ailments. When Overbury consumed Carr's powders, his physiological torment violently escalated. Forensic historians theorize that Carr, while perhaps not actively coordinating the daily logistics of the Howard poison ring, was simultaneously supplying Overbury with powerful emetics, substances designed to induce violent vomiting. Carr likely intended to keep Overbury incapacitated, sick enough to prevent him from communicating with the king, but perhaps not specifically intending the agonizing, prolonged death engineered by his future wife. Regardless of Carr's exact forensic intent, his deliberate refusal to extract his former partner facilitated the continuation of the biological siege. By early September 1613, the assassination operation was entering a critical crisis phase. Sir Thomas Overbury, possessing a robust natural constitution, was stubbornly clinging to life despite 5 months of continuous heavy metal poisoning. The Howards panicked. The annulment of Francis Howard's marriage was nearing its final, publicized conclusion. If Overbury miraculously survived the chemical siege and recovered sufficiently to testify or leak the ledgers, the entire political alignment of the English state would collapse. The strategy of plausible deniability was abandoned. They required a definitive, fatal conclusion. On September 14, 1613, Richard Weston, operating under accelerated direct orders from Francis Howard, abandoned the slow-acting contaminated food. He procured a massive, concentrated dose of corrosive sublimate of mercury to ensure maximum, unrecoverable internal damage and rapid absorption into the bloodstream. The poison was not administered orally. Weston, assisted by William Reeve, a young apprentice to the French apothecary Paul de Lobel, who had been smuggled into the tower perimeter, prepared a specialized medical instrument. They pumped the concentrated acidic heavy metal directly into Overbury's body via a clyster, an enema. The introduction of the corrosive acid directly into the lower gastrointestinal tract caused instantaneous, catastrophic necrosis of the intestinal walls. Sir Thomas Overbury died in a state of unimaginable, convulsing agony in the early hours of September 15. The immediate aftermath of the assassination was managed with ruthless bureaucratic efficiency. To prevent the discovery of the extensive chemical damage, the Howard faction utilized their administrative control to completely bypass standard post-mortem legal protocols. There was no formal autopsy conducted by the royal physicians. The coroner of the Tower was presented with a corpse covered in severe weeping ulcers and dark lesions. Acting under extreme political intimidation from Lieutenant Helwys, the coroner rapidly falsified the official death certificate. He recorded the cause of death as an aggressive, late-stage manifestation of syphilis, the pox, utilizing the visible skin lesions as plausible visual evidence for the public record before the physical degradation of the corpse could raise further suspicion among the guards. Overbury's remains were wrapped in a simple sheet and hastily buried within the confines of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, located deep within the secure perimeter of the Tower of London. The physical evidence was buried beneath stone. The lower-level operatives were paid for their silence, and the political narrative was secured. With the threat of Overbury permanently eradicated, the political architecture of the English state was rapidly restructured to accommodate the dominance of the Howard faction and their newly acquired asset. In December 1613, mere months after the agonizing death in the Tower, King James I authorized and personally funded one of the most lavish, expensive, and visible royal weddings of the decade. The king formally elevated Robert Carr to the peerage as the first Earl of Somerset. The marriage of the Earl of Somerset to Frances Howard represented the zenith of their power. They stood at the very pinnacle of English aristocratic society, untouchable by the law, completely insulated by the sovereign's devotion, and commanding the vast logistical and financial resources of the empire. The crime appeared perfectly executed and permanently interred. However, the maintenance of unchecked power built upon a foundation of state-sponsored assassination required a level of psychological discipline that Robert Carr simply did not possess. Without the stabilizing, strategic intellect of Thomas Overbury to process the daily pressures of governance, Carr's administrative capabilities began to buckle under the sheer weight of the empire. Living with the continuous, crushing paranoia of discovery, Carr underwent a severe psychological deterioration. The soft, charming, submissive demeanor that had originally captivated King James I completely evaporated. Carr became violently irritable, deeply suspicious of his fellow counselors, and aggressively erratic. Crucially, he committed the ultimate tactical error of the Jacobean court. He began to direct his hostility to the sovereign. Carr started barking administrative orders at King James, demanding compliance rather than requesting favors, and attempting to monopolize the monarch through intimidation rather than affection. The king, who demanded absolute visual perfection and psychological comfort from his favorites, was deeply alienated by Carr's newfound aggression. The anti-Howard factions within the Privy Council, specifically the Earl of Pembroke, the Earl of Southampton, and Archbishop George Abbot, monitored the deteriorating dynamic between the king and his enforcer with intense, calculated interest. Recognizing the vulnerability in the king's emotional armor, the opposition executed a brilliant counter-offensive. In August 1614, they deliberately positioned a new, breathtakingly handsome, refined young man directly in the king's line of sight during a royal progress. His name was George Villiers, the future Duke of Buckingham. As King James's obsessive, volatile affections began to slowly transfer toward the vibrant youth of Villiers, the impenetrable shield of royal favor protecting Robert Carr began to systematically fracture. The political environment was shifting, and the vast, pressurized conspiracy, buried beneath the stones of the Tower of London, was about to violently detonate. The most sophisticated political conspiracies rarely collapse from the top. They are structurally compromised from the bottom. The Howard faction had successfully executed a complex assassination, neutralized the coroner, and insulated the aristocratic architects behind the absolute power of the English crown. However, the entire operation relied upon a fragile, decentralized logistics network composed of low-ranking operatives who possessed neither the discipline nor the political protection of their employers. The perfect crime was undone by a logistical oversight. William Reeve, the young apothecary's apprentice, who had physically aided in synthesizing the poisons and pumping the fatal heavy metals into Sir Thomas Overbury, fled England shortly after the assassination. By the summer of 1615, this operative was working in Flushing, a port city in the Dutch Republic. Removed from the immediate terror of the Howard network, the boy's operational discipline evaporated. During a drunken exchange in a local tavern, he began bragging about his proximity to the highest echelons of English power. He openly detailed the entire horrifying forensic timeline of the Overbury assassination, naming the specific chemical compounds, the delivery methods, and the aristocratic financiers. This raw intelligence was immediately intercepted. It reached William Trumbull, an English diplomat stationed in the Low Countries. Trumbull recognized the explosive geopolitical value of the information. He bypassed standard diplomatic channels and transmitted the intelligence directly to Sir Ralph Winwood in London. Winwood was the newly appointed Secretary of State. More importantly, he was a staunch Protestant, a staunch anti-Howard operator, and a bitter political enemy of Robert Carr. Winwood now possessed the precise intelligence required to completely dismantle the pro-Spain faction. Winwood bypassed the Privy Council, where Carr still held massive influence, and presented the evidence directly to King James I. The king's reaction was driven entirely by political self-preservation. James was terrified. If the public or the Parliament discovered that the king's unrivaled favorite had utilized a royal fortress to execute a political opponent, the crown itself would be directly implicated in the assassination. To insulate the monarchy and project the illusion of impartial justice, James had no choice but to authorize a full-scale, visible criminal investigation. The king handed the operational reins to Sir Edward Coke, the Lord Chief Justice of England. Coke was a notoriously unyielding legal operator, obsessed with the strict mechanics of English common law and deeply hostile to the extra-legal abuses of the king's favorites. Granted full authority, Coke initiated a massive forensic audit. He conducted over 300 relentless, aggressive interrogations. He started from the bottom of the logistics chain and methodically worked his way up. Coke dismantled the conspiracy piece by piece, securing confessions from the apothecary, the jailer, the cosmetics broker, and the compromised lieutenant of the Tower. By the autumn of 1615, the state possessed an airtight, heavily documented case, proving that the Earl and Countess of Somerset were the undisputed architects of the murder. The sheer brutality and star-class asymmetry of the 17th century justice system were put on full display. Sir Edward Coke dragged the lower-class conspirators, jailer Richard Weston, apothecary James Franklin, and logistics broker Anne Turner, alongside Lieutenant Gervase Helwys, before the king's bench because the operatives lacked high noble titles. They were systematically stripped of any meaningful legal defense. Under the crushing weight of the chemical evidence and their own conflicting panicked testimonies, all 4 conspirators were swiftly condemned to death. Weston, Franklin, and Turner were transported to the infamous Tyburn gallows, where tens of thousands of commoners gathered to witness the executions. Sir Gervase Helwys, possessing a knighthood, was granted the distinct aristocratic privilege of being executed at Tower Hill, yet his ultimate biological fate remained the same. In a moment of calculated, cruel judicial theater, Anne Turner was ordered by Justice Coke to wear her own famous invention, the yellow starched ruff, to her execution. As the rope snapped her neck, the yellow fashion trend instantly died, permanently associated with the visual aesthetic of a state murderer. The English public watched the accomplices bleed and dangle from the ropes, completely aware of the stark political reality. The working-class operatives had paid the ultimate physical price, while the aristocratic masterminds remained safely barricaded behind palace walls, awaiting a separate, privileged legal process. With the lower-ranking witnesses legally silenced by the executioner, the state finally turned its jurisdiction toward the elite. In May 1616, Robert Carr and Francis Howard were brought to trial. Because of their supreme aristocratic rank, they were legally exempt from the common courts. They were granted a trial by peers in the grand, formalized setting of Westminster Hall. The prosecution was led by the Attorney General, Sir Francis Bacon, a brilliant philosopher and a ruthless legal tactician. Frances Howard faced the tribunal first, confronted with undeniable physical documentary evidence, including her own handwritten, intercepted letters to the apothecary explicitly begging for poisons and occult charms, her psychological resolve entirely shattered. Dressed in modest, somber black clothing, she wept bitterly before the Assembly of Lords. She confessed to every charge and formally begged the Crown for mercy. Her immediate confession bypassed a brutal cross-examination, but the legal mechanics were absolute. She was immediately sentenced to death. The following day, Robert Carr took the stand. In stark contrast to his terrified wife, Carr radiated the furious, unyielding pride of a man who had once possessed unchallenged dominance over the empire. Denied the right to a defense lawyer by standard protocol, Carr fought for his life for 11 grueling hours. His rhetorical capability shocked the assembly. Carr freely admitted to the political conspiracy of tricking Overbury into the Tower, claiming it was a necessary administrative maneuver to protect state secrets. However, he fiercely and vehemently denied possessing any foreknowledge of the chemical assassination, projecting the entirety of the blame squarely onto his wife and the Howard network. Despite his brilliant defense, Francis Bacon's ruthless legal logic and the predetermined political bias of the jury sealed his fate. The anti-Howard faction had successfully stacked the tribunal. Carr was found guilty of murder. The former ruler of England was sentenced to hang, a profound, calculated insult, as high-ranking nobles were traditionally granted the swift, honorable mercy of the executioner's axe. The climax of the Overbury scandal became the unrivaled peak of legal outrage in the history of the Stuart dynasty. The rigid majesty of English common law was completely bent and ultimately shattered by the personal terror and lingering affection of the king. King James I was plunged into an agonizing psychological paralysis. Despite his newly established devotion to George Villiers, James physically could not bring himself to sign the death warrant for the man who had entirely monopolized his affections for 7 years. Even from his prison cell, Robert Carr held a formidable political advantage. He threatened that, if condemned to the scaffold, he would publicly expose highly damaging personal secrets about the king. Such a revelation would have caused a devastating scandal, severely undermining the moral authority and reputation of the crown. Driven by nostalgia, political panic, and the dread of a monumental geopolitical scandal, James I invoked the unfettered power of the royal prerogative. Just days before the scheduled execution, the king suspended the sentence. The executioner's blade never fell. Frances Howard, having confessed and humbled herself before the tribunal, received a full, formalized royal pardon for her death sentence in 1616. Robert Carr, however, stubbornly and aggressively maintained his innocence. Because he refused to admit guilt, the king could not immediately issue a formal pardon. Carr's death sentence remained in a suspended state of legal limbo, and he would not receive his official royal pardon until 1624, long after his power had evaporated. This executive decision spat directly in the face of the English Constitution and public morality. It provided the nation with undeniable, documented proof that in the Stuart era, the law was a razor-sharp sword designed to slaughter the working poor, but a soft silk blanket engineered to protect the ruling elite. The king's pardon saved their physical lives, but Robert Carr's political authority, social standing, and vast economic empire were effectively executed on that same scaffold. The couple was not granted freedom. They were remanded directly back into the very same Tower of London where they had ordered Overbury's agonizing death. They were permitted to live in relative comfort, surrounded by personal servants and fine furniture, but they were permanently exiled from the machinery of state power, stripped of their political utility. The burning, reckless passion that had driven them to commit murder curdled into toxic, suffocating hatred. Confined within the same stone fortress, Carr and Frances despised one another so deeply that historical accounts indicate they refused to even look at each other for years. In 1622, after 7 years of captivity, James I finally authorized their release from the Tower, but Carr was a ghost. His vast estates and monopolies had been seized by the crown and redistributed to Villiers. His title of Earl of Somerset was a hollow, powerless mockery. He was universally shunned by the very nobility that had once paid massive bribes simply to kiss his ring. Frances Howard died in 1632. She suffered from a horrific, painful degenerative disease of the womb, an affliction the English public viciously and openly celebrated as targeted, divine retribution for her chemical crimes. Robert Carr lived on in forced, complete obscurity, entirely forgotten by the crown he had once controlled. He lived just long enough to watch the total collapse of the Stuart dynasty, dying in 1645 in a country being ripped apart by a bloody civil war. The poisoning of Sir Thomas Overbury was more than a 17th-century murder scandal. It exposed the systemic corruption of unrestrained monarchy under the Stuart dynasty. Robert Carr built an empire on royal affection and destroyed it through his own arrogance. But the true casualty was the moral authority of the English crown. King James I cheerfully hanged the working-class operatives while using his royal prerogative to pardon the aristocratic masterminds. This blatant hypocrisy shattered the illusion of blind justice. The Overbury scandal planted the seeds of deep public resentment. It provided undeniable proof that the crown viewed itself as above the law, a resentment that, decades later, would directly fuel the English Civil War and cost King Charles I his head. Robert Carr left no political legacy, only the blueprint for a dynasty's collapse.